In 2012, an Oregon mother opened up a package of Halloween decorations. The cheap foam headstone had been $5 at Kmart. Too good a deal to pass up. But when she opened the box, something shocking fell out. An SOS letter handwritten in broken English. Sir, if you occasionally buy this product, please kindly resend this letter to the World Human Rights Organization. Thousands of people here who are under the persecution of the Chinese Communist Party government will thank and remember you forever.
In Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods, investigative journalist Amelia uses extensive interviews and firsthand reporting to pull back the curtain on the imprisoned Chinese man behind the note, ultimately shining light on a network of forced Chinese labor camps and exposing the true cost of America's rapidly growing consumerism and high demand for cheap goods. Amelia joins us now to expand. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. Thanks so much for joining us. So can you tell us a little bit about the journey that this set off?
Right. As it turns out, the author of this chilling SOS letter was one of millions of forced laborers in China manufacturing all kinds of products for us. So my book explored who he was, how people like him landed in these types of labor camps, what their experiences were like there, but also the failures of the way that our corporations are auditing their factories in China, the loopholes in the supply chain that make it very easy for products manufactured in a gruesome labor camp where torture and starvation is rampant. It's easy for products in these camps to land in a Kmart in Portland, Oregon.
So how did you, by chance, how were you able to track down the author of that note? Did they put a name on it?
He didn't have a name, but he was actually a political dissident, and after he got out of the camp, he was he very much wanted to talk to the Western press and seek journalists.
That's really interesting. So you were able to then find. Now, what is the Chinese government? According to the Global Slavery Index, much of this forced labor is going on through human trafficking, much through Vietnam. So there's human traffickers that go into Vietnam. They round up people, they take them, and they're basically sold off to these companies who then use them for cheap labor. And the Chinese government has actually been cracking down on that. So are you specifically looking into that type of forced labor, or are you specifically just looking at the state-imposed forced labor inside of the prison system?
This book centers on the state-imposed forced labor system. Forced labor is such a broad topic. There's many different types of forced labor happening all over the world. So this book examines the re-education through labor camps and other previous detention centers that have existed really since the 1940s. These camps were initially based off of Soviet gulags. The prisoners were mostly political prisoners, and they were kept alive for their source as a free labor for the Chinese economy. And with each development, with each major leap of the Chinese economy, there's been a growth of camps. They've always had pretty torturous conditions, but in recent years, we're seeing the latest iteration and probably the darkest iteration of these camps, which are the ones that are targeting Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic minorities in China, because the intent behind these camps is to destroy an entire ethnic group.
How much detail do we have about these camps? How much specificity? What kind of evidence were you able to acquire?
Actually, in early 2019, I went to China to visit one of these camps. It wasn't one of the Uyghur camps, but it was another forced labor facility. I posed as a buyer from a Chinese company that wanted to source from these camps, and the guards openly acknowledged that this was a prison camp and that they did manufacturing work there, and I could buy products from them. I spent some time following the trucks that left this facility to see which suppliers they were working with, and found that they were working with a number of exporters, including a major Apple supplier. The exact address was listed on Apple's supplier list. And when I reached out to Apple to ask what kind of audits they were conducting to make sure that their factories don't have relationships with forced labor facilities, they declined to provide any information.
I'm curious, with this. I mean, we obviously have the same sort of issue here in the United States where people talk about the forced labor going on in our own prison system as well, and firefighters being kind of recruited and paid $1 a day or something from our prison system, which is really, it seems like fairly horrific. But what is, so if we were to remove this sort of labor in the prisons, what do we want people in prison to be doing? I think what the Chinese government says in relation to these, to the re-education through labor system that they've had, they said that they got rid of it in 2013, but there's still evidence that by 2017 it was still going on. I'm not sure if there's evidence of it still happening today, but I mean, you're saying that in 2019 you went and you saw it yourself. But was that 2019 that you mentioned that? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
So these camps were all reopened in
right.
2019.
Yeah. So if we're not going to have, I mean, prisoners doing jobs, I suppose, and I mean, I think they should be paid for those jobs. But if they're not going to be doing the jobs, what do they do while they're in prison?
That's a great point, and I'm glad you brought up the American prison system. We do have a mass incarceration problem in this country, but the vast majority of the prisoners are not doing labor, unlike in China, where you have millions of people who have actually been sentenced, and also all these extra legal detention centers, people who are stuck there without ever having had a trial, without access to lawyers, stuck there indefinitely doing forced labor. I think the prisoners, at least you hear from the survivors, they prefer not to be working 15 hours a day, sometimes even 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and receiving less than $2 a month for their work in some cases no money at all for their work. It's not quite comparable to the U.S. system.
What types of prisoners wind up in these systems? Like, how does a person, go from everyday life to getting wrapped up in one of these modern-day gulags?
It used to be that these camps primarily targeted political dissidents, religious dissidents, rights defenders. A lot of the student protesters from the 1989 Tiananmen protests ended up in these camps. They were just a convenient way to silence dissent. And there were also a lot of petty criminals who ended up in these camps as a source of free labor. But now, with the rise of the Uyghur camps, you're seeing an entire ethnic group targeted. There's grandmothers that are landing in these camps, mothers landing in these camps, young men and old men without any kind of history with political dissent. It's just an entire ethnic group that's targeted.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, definitely, this whole thing with the it's interesting on how different countries decide to approach prison and what they want their prisoners to do. I know throughout Asia, it's definitely labor camps. Prison, being sentenced to hard labor is unfortunately a thing that happens. And that is, really atrocious for sure. So it's definitely good to shine light on that, on the differences of, how people are in Thailand and North Korea and China, all around Vietnam, what the prisoners are forced to do.
Thank you for this opportunity. I also want to say Made in China is ultimately about the small actionable steps that the average consumer can take to push our favorite brands to be accountable, to do more in the way that they inspect and audit their supply chain, because there's a number of things that our companies can be doing to deter forced labor from entering their factories. But as of now, there's no requirement for them to do so.
Right. Oh, well, Amelia Pang, in the book is called Made in China. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. And we'll have more Rising right after this.